While the world focuses on conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza, a terror organization in East Africa has quietly achieved what many considered impossible. Al-Shabaab has managed to encircle Mogadishu using siege tactics adapted to modern warfare through strategic checkpoints, roadblocks, and systematic taxation networks. They control the roads, they tax the businesses, and they've turned the Somali capital into what military analysts are now calling a city under siege. Even with 13,500 ATMIS troops around Mogadishu, divided command and restrictive mandates have left Al-Shabaab free to tighten their grip. But understanding how this siege succeeded requires examining something even more troubling than the tactics themselves. The ghost government of Somalia. The Somali federal government controls limited urban areas, relies on ATMIS for security, and struggles to collect taxes outside Mogadishu, creating a power vacuum that extends far beyond standard failed state metrics. When foreign diplomats meet with Somali officials in heavily fortified compounds, they're engaging with an administration whose authority barely extends beyond the buildings where these meetings take place. The institutional collapse in Somalia has achieved something more complete than typical broken nations that struggle with corruption or weak institutions. Somalia has witnessed the wholesale replacement of government authority with a complex web of clan-based power brokers who operate their own militias, taxation systems, and judicial processes. These traditional structures have proven far more durable and responsive to local needs than any attempt at central governance. The federal government's inability to perform basic state functions has created a vacuum so profound that many Somalis have never experienced legitimate government services in their lifetime. Per CTC net assessments, only Danube and Gorger brigades meet basic standards. The rest lack training and equipment. Police forces operate more like clan militias than law enforcement agencies, responding to tribal allegiances rather than legal authority. The judicial system functions sporadically at best, with many regions relying entirely on traditional clan elders and Islamic courts for dispute resolution. This governmental void created ideal conditions for Al-Shabaab's siege strategy because the group understood they weren't competing against a functioning state, but rather against a collection of competing power centers with no unified command structure. While international observers focused on building democratic institutions and holding elections, Al-Shabaab built parallel governance systems that actually delivered services to populations abandoned by the federal government. With divisions across powerful clans, inconsistent salaries, desertions of 1,300 Gorger troops, and human rights abuses by security partners, government forces have lost credibility and operational unity. Intelligence networks have been so thoroughly penetrated that planned military operations are often known to Al-Shabaab commanders before they're executed. The group has cultivated sources throughout the government hierarchy, from low-level clerks who provide administrative intelligence to high-ranking officials who warn of impending operations in exchange for cash payments. Military units operate more like business enterprises than fighting forces, with commanders viewing their positions as opportunities for personal enrichment rather than national service. Soldiers frequently abandon their posts to join better-paying clan militias, or even defect to Al-Shabaab when government salaries go unpaid for months. The result is a military that exists in name only, incapable of conducting sustained operations against a disciplined enemy. International recognition of the Somali government has actually hindered effective intervention by creating diplomatic constraints that benefit Al-Shabaab. Foreign governments must work through official channels that often lead nowhere, while Al-Shabaab operates with complete tactical flexibility. International aid flows through government ministries that lack the capacity to distribute it effectively, creating opportunities for Al-Shabaab to intercept resources while maintaining plausible deniability. The economic reality on the ground reveals the true extent of governmental failure. In many areas under nominal government control, Al-Shabaab provides more reliable electricity, water, and telecommunications services than official authorities. Their courts resolve disputes faster and more predictably than the formal legal system. Business owners often prefer dealing with Al-Shabaab tax collectors because the rates are fixed and transparent, unlike the arbitrary demands from corrupt government officials. This service delivery extends to areas that governments typically monopolize. Al-Shabaab operates schools that actually function, providing education to children whose government schools have been closed for years due to lack of funding or teachers. Their medical clinics serve populations that have no access to government health services. They maintain roads that the government has allowed to deteriorate, and they provide security that government forces cannot guarantee. The government's chronic inability to pay soldiers has created a revolving door of defections that continuously strengthens Al-Shabaab while weakening official forces. Government soldiers who haven't been paid in months are easily recruited by Al-Shabaab with promises of steady income and regular meals. These defectors bring with them intimate knowledge of government military capabilities, planned operations, and defensive positions. Even when the government manages to scrape together funds for military salaries, the payments often arrive months late and in amounts insufficient to support soldiers' families. This has created a situation where government forces are fighting not just Al-Shabaab, but also poverty and hunger within their own ranks. Many soldiers supplement their income by selling military equipment or providing information to whoever pays the most. The clan dynamics that dominate Somali society have been expertly exploited by Al-Shabaab to further weaken government authority. The group recruits heavily from clans that feel marginalized by the current government, offering them positions of authority within Al-Shabaab's hierarchy that they could never achieve in the formal political system. They've also mastered the art of playing different clans against each other, preventing the formation of unified opposition to their expansion. Government ministers and officials often represent clan interests rather than national ones, making coordinated policy implementation nearly impossible. Cabinet meetings become negotiations between competing tribal factions rather than discussions of how to govern effectively. This fragmentation makes it impossible for the government to present a united front against Al-Shabaab's focus campaign. Fighting an insurgency without legitimacy among your own people creates strategic challenges that conventional military doctrine cannot address. Government forces cannot rely on local intelligence because the population often views them as just another armed group competing for control. They cannot secure territory because they lack the administrative capacity to govern areas they capture. They cannot build popular support because they cannot deliver the basic services that legitimacy requires. Al-Shabaab has exploited this legitimacy gap by positioning themselves as the more credible governing authority, capable of providing order and services that the official government cannot match. This has transformed what should be a counterinsurgency campaign into something resembling a war between competing governments, with Al-Shabaab holding significant advantages in organization, discipline, and local support. Understanding these advantages reveals how the group has managed to execute a strategy that modern military analysts initially considered obsolete. Al-Shabaab's medieval playbook. Al-Shabaab's tactical approach represents a calculated adaptation of classical siege principles to modern warfare conditions. They have captured key towns including Adan Yabal and Abur, establishing a 1,600-kilometer siege perimeter around Mogadishu while controlling 8 checkpoints on the main highways according to detailed mapping by security analysts. Rather than relying on outdated military doctrine, they have weaponized Somalia's limited road network and traditional clan systems to create a stranglehold that modern counterterrorism strategies have failed to address. The group's systematic control over roads and supply lines demonstrates how classical siege principles can be adapted to contemporary urban warfare. They understand that controlling the approaches to a major city remains more effective than attempting direct assault against superior firepower. Al-Shabaab has applied this logic by establishing dominance over the highways that connect Mogadishu to agricultural regions and international borders. They recognize that urban centers cannot survive indefinitely without continuous flows of food, fuel, and medical supplies through these critical arteries. Their approach to cutting off Mogadishu's economic lifelines reveals sophisticated understanding of modern urban dependencies. Rather than attempting conventional military conquest, they have focused on strangling the city's connections to external resources. They systematically target fuel convoys that power the city's generators and transportation networks. They disrupt food shipments from agricultural regions that feed Mogadishu's population. They interfere with medical supply deliveries that keep hospitals operational. This methodical strangulation creates conditions that make continued resistance increasingly costly for both government forces and civilian populations. Somalia's geography provides natural advantages that Al-Shabaab has exploited with remarkable effectiveness. The country's limited road infrastructure creates choke points that can be controlled with relatively small numbers of fighters positioned at strategic locations. The main highways connecting Mogadishu to southern Somalia's agricultural heartland pass through terrain that favors defensive positions over attacking forces. Al-Shabaab has established checkpoints along these routes that function as revenue collection points while controlling the movement of goods and people. The group's checkpoint system, known locally as Isbaro, has become deeply embedded in the social and economic fabric of regions surrounding Mogadishu. These positions serve multiple strategic functions beyond simple military control. They generate substantial revenue through systematic taxation of commercial traffic, with research indicating collections of approximately $30 per truck per checkpoint. They provide continuous intelligence about government movements and civilian activities. They demonstrate Al-Shabaab's administrative authority to local populations who must negotiate passage for basic travel and commerce. The practice of abanship, which traditionally involved clan-based brokerage of passage through territorial boundaries, has been co-opted by Al-Shabaab to formalize their control over regional mobility and trade. This system allows them to extract revenue from motorists while reinforcing their position as the de facto governing authority in areas under their influence. The integration of traditional practices with modern taxation methods has created a revenue stream that rivals legitimate government collections in many regions. Their patient approach sets them apart from other insurgent organizations that prioritize spectacular attacks over sustained territorial control. Al-Shabaab has demonstrated willingness to invest years in establishing positions around Mogadishu rather than seeking immediate publicity through dramatic operations. This long-term perspective reflects strategic thinking that prioritizes sustainable control over momentary tactical victories. Their commanders appear to understand that meaningful territorial control requires sustained commitment rather than episodic military successes. The siege tactics around Adan Yabal have effectively disconnected Mogadishu from critical agricultural supply lines, causing hundreds of civilian displacements in early 2025 as farmers and traders abandoned areas under Al-Shabaab pressure. This systematic disruption of food production and distribution networks demonstrates how the group weaponizes civilian infrastructure to achieve military objectives. The displacement of agricultural workers creates cascading effects that reduce food availability in Mogadishu while demonstrating Al-Shabaab's capacity to control rural populations. Al-Shabaab has demonstrated remarkable skill in turning Mogadishu's infrastructure against its defenders. They have infiltrated telecommunications networks to gather intelligence and spread propaganda throughout the city. They have penetrated electrical systems to control power supplies in specific neighborhoods. They have compromised water treatment facilities to create health crises that strain government resources and demonstrate their reach into supposedly secure areas. The coordination between military pressure and economic strangulation reveals strategic sophistication that few insurgent groups achieve. While maintaining military threats through regular attacks and the constant possibility of major operations, they simultaneously tighten economic restrictions that make normal life increasingly difficult for urban populations. This dual approach prevents government forces from focusing exclusively on military threats while ensuring that civilian populations experience the consequences of continued resistance. Their systematic approach to controlling economic choke points extends beyond roadblocks to encompass entire trade networks that sustain regional commerce. They regulate livestock movement from pastoral regions to urban markets, controlling access to protein sources that feed city populations. They monitor agricultural activities during critical harvest seasons, determining which crops reach market and which remain in rural areas. They oversee fishing operations along coastal and inland waterways, controlling access to marine protein sources. The group's willingness to inflict casualties while maintaining siege pressure has manifested in calculated attacks designed to demonstrate their continued capability to strike within the city. Recent operations have included suicide bombings targeting military recruitment centers and coordinated attacks on government installations. These operations serve dual purposes of degrading government capabilities while reminding populations that Al-Shabaab retains initiative in determining when and where violence occurs. This comprehensive control over movement and commerce has created dependencies that make resistance increasingly expensive for both military forces and civilian populations. The demonstration that classical siege principles remain effective against modern urban centers represents a significant evolution in asymmetric warfare with implications extending far beyond Somalia's borders. But the most disturbing aspect of their strategy becomes apparent when examining how they have managed to extend their revenue collection operations beyond these rural checkpoints into areas supposedly under government control. The Taxation Empire. Al-Shabaab operates what amounts to a parallel taxation authority that generates an estimated $100 million annually, funding roughly 5,000 to 10,000 well-armed fighters and extensive networks of operatives throughout Somalia. This isn't some distant rural operation or theoretical threat. Al-Shabaab tax collectors operate in areas surrounding Mogadishu and throughout southern Somalia, where business owners regularly receive visits from well-dressed men who present detailed invoices for services the government cannot provide and protection the official security forces cannot guarantee. The sophistication of their revenue collection system rivals legitimate governments in its scope and efficiency. Al-Shabaab maintains detailed registries of every significant business operating in southern Somalia, tracking everything from telecommunications companies to small grocery stores. Their tax assessors conduct regular audits of commercial operations, examining financial records with the thoroughness of professional accountants. They have established standardized tax rates across different sectors and maintain consistent collection schedules that businesses can predict and plan around. This creates the surreal situation where companies pay dual taxes to competing authorities claiming jurisdiction over the same territory. A construction company working on a government contract will receive official tax bills from the Federal Ministry of Finance. The same company will also receive separate invoices from Al-Shabaab representatives demanding payment for what they term security services and business licensing fees. Refusal to pay either set of taxes results in immediate consequences, but the nature of those consequences reveals which authority wields real power on the ground. The group's mobile money taxation system demonstrates a level of technological sophistication that many recognized governments struggle to achieve. Al-Shabaab monitors digital transactions through Somalia's mobile banking networks, which handle the majority of financial transfers in a country where traditional banking infrastructure remains limited. They have developed software that tracks money movements and automatically calculates tax obligations based on transaction volumes. Business owners report receiving text messages within hours of large transfers, demanding immediate payment of taxes on digital transactions they assumed were private. Their infiltration of the formal banking sector allows them to monitor large transfers and identify potential tax targets with remarkable precision. Sources within Somalia's banking industry report that Al-Shabaab operatives hold positions throughout the financial system, from junior clerks who copy transaction records to senior managers who provide advance warning of government fund transfers. This infiltration gives them real-time intelligence about economic activity that enables targeted taxation of specific businesses and individuals. Al-Shabaab extorts between 5 to 10% of road transport fees under its control, according to Africa Center analysis, affecting commercial traffic throughout southern Somalia. These payments are collected through intermediaries who present themselves as local business facilitators but function as tax collectors for Al-Shabaab. International companies have discovered that failure to pay these unofficial fees results in mysterious delays, equipment malfunctions, and security incidents that make operations increasingly expensive and dangerous. Container inspection procedures have been compromised by Al-Shabaab operatives who use their positions to identify valuable shipments for additional taxation. Customs officials report pressure to share manifests and cargo details with unauthorized parties who then target specific shipments for extra fees. This system operates so smoothly that many international companies budget for these payments as routine business expenses rather than extortion payments to a terrorist organization. Taxing humanitarian convoys generates funds and yields intelligence on aid routes, an approach documented by the UN monitoring team as a core revenue source for Al-Shabaab in areas like Baidoa and Kismayo. International agencies face the impossible choice between paying taxes to a designated terrorist organization or allowing critical supplies to sit in warehouses while vulnerable populations suffer. The agricultural taxation system in rural areas surrounding Mogadishu provides Al-Shabaab with leverage over the city's food supply that extends far beyond simple checkpoint control. Farmers throughout southern Somalia pay annual taxes calculated as percentages of their expected harvests. These payments are collected during planting season, giving Al-Shabaab advance claims on agricultural production months before crops reach market. This system allows them to control food prices in Mogadishu by regulating the supply of agricultural products reaching urban markets. Livestock taxation follows similar patterns, with pastoralists paying fees based on herd sizes and expected breeding rates. Al-Shabaab tax collectors conduct regular censuses of livestock populations, tracking animal movements across grazing areas they control or influence. This gives them detailed knowledge of protein supplies that feed Mogadishu's population and creates additional pressure points for their siege strategy. The revenue generated through this comprehensive taxation system funds military operations that government forces cannot match in terms of equipment, training, or consistency. Al-Shabaab fighters receive regular salaries that arrive on schedule, unlike government soldiers who often go months without payment. Their weapons procurement operates through well-funded networks that can afford high-quality equipment from regional arms markets. Their training facilities receive consistent funding that allows for professional military instruction rather than the sporadic exercises that characterize government military preparation. This financial stability translates into operational advantages that compound over time. Al-Shabaab can plan long-term operations knowing they have reliable funding streams, while government forces struggle to maintain basic equipment and personnel. They can afford intelligence networks that provide advance warning of government operations, while official forces operate with compromised communications and unreliable information. They can sustain siege operations over extended periods because their funding sources remain intact even during active military campaigns. The psychological impact of this financial disparity affects every aspect of the conflict. Government forces understand they are fighting an enemy that can outspend them on equipment, training, and operational support. This knowledge undermines morale and contributes to the defection rates that continuously weaken official military capabilities. The sight of well-equipped Al-Shabaab fighters operating with professional discipline stands in stark contrast to the shabby appearance and erratic behavior of government forces struggling with basic supply shortages. International efforts to disrupt Al-Shabaab's taxation system have failed because the networks operate through legitimate business channels that cannot be eliminated without destroying Somalia's entire economy. The mobile money systems that Al-Shabaab exploits also provide essential financial services to millions of Somalis who have no access to traditional banking. This creates a situation where Al-Shabaab's taxation authority has become more reliable and predictable than the government's own revenue collection efforts, giving them de facto legitimacy among populations who depend on economic stability for survival. But financial resources alone cannot explain Al-Shabaab's sustained military effectiveness against numerically superior government forces. The group has solved the fundamental challenge that limits most insurgent organizations by developing recruitment methods that ensure a continuous supply of fighters willing to sustain the child soldier assembly line. These recruitment networks operate with industrial efficiency that produces fighters faster than military casualties can deplete their ranks. In 2022 alone, the United Nations documented 663 children abducted by Al-Shabaab for military purposes. This represents just the cases that international observers managed to verify, meaning the actual numbers are certainly higher. These statistics become even more disturbing when you consider that this recruitment operates as a continuous process rather than occasional kidnapping incidents. The group has developed educational indoctrination programs that begin targeting children as young as 7 years old through a network of schools that masquerade as religious education centers. These institutions operate throughout Al-Shabaab-controlled territory and in areas where government authority remains weak or non-existent. The curriculum at these schools combines basic literacy and numeracy instruction with intensive religious indoctrination designed to prepare children for eventual military service. Teachers at these facilities are carefully selected Al-Shabaab members who have received specialized training in child psychology and religious instruction. Children enrolled in these programs undergo years of gradual conditioning that normalizes violence and creates absolute loyalty to Al-Shabaab leadership. The educational process carefully balances academic instruction with ideological preparation, ensuring that children develop useful skills while simultaneously accepting Al-Shabaab's worldview as natural and inevitable. Students learn to read and write using textbooks filled with militant imagery and stories of martyrdom. Mathematics lessons incorporate examples involving weapons calculations and logistics planning for military operations. Somalia's broader education crisis has created ideal conditions for Al-Shabaab to position their schools as the only reliable source of education available to many families. The federal government operates fewer than half the schools it claims to run, and many of those functions sporadically due to funding shortages and security concerns. Teachers in government schools often go months without salaries, leading to frequent closures and inconsistent instruction. This educational vacuum leaves millions of Somali children with no access to formal schooling, making Al-Shabaab's institutions attractive to parents desperate to provide their children with any form of education. The group has systematically weaponized this desperation by establishing schools in areas where government education services have collapsed entirely. They recruit teachers who have been abandoned by the formal education system, offering steady salaries and professional support that the government cannot provide. These educators often begin working for Al-Shabaab schools out of economic necessity, only gradually becoming aware of the institution's true purpose as they witness the transformation of their students over months and years of attendance. Religious schools throughout southern Somalia have become primary recruitment centers where Al-Shabaab operatives identify promising candidates for military training. The group has infiltrated existing Islamic educational institutions and established new madrasas specifically designed to feed their recruitment pipeline. Students who demonstrate particular aptitude for memorizing religious texts or show signs of leadership potential receive special attention from instructors who begin preparing them for advanced training programs. The selection process for military recruitment operates through careful observation of students over extended periods. Al-Shabaab instructors monitor children for signs of physical capability, intellectual capacity, and psychological suitability for different military roles. Some children are identified as potential commanders and receive additional education focused on leadership skills and strategic thinking. Others are selected for technical roles and begin learning electronics, communications, and engineering skills that support Al-Shabaab's operational capabilities. The psychological conditioning techniques employed in these institutions create fanatically loyal fighters who view death in service to Al-Shabaab as the highest possible achievement. Children undergo gradual exposure to violence that begins with graphic videos and images, progresses to witnessing executions and torture, and culminates in direct participation in violent acts against prisoners or suspected enemies. This systematic desensitization process transforms normal children into individuals capable of extreme violence without emotional distress or moral hesitation. The military training regimen that follows this psychological preparation lasts between 3 and 6 months and encompasses physical conditioning, obstacle courses, religious education, tactical instruction, intelligence gathering, weapon handling, and improvised explosive device construction. The physical training pushes children to their limits through force marches, combat exercises, and endurance tests designed to build both physical capability and mental toughness. Children who fail to meet standards face punishment that ranges from additional training to physical abuse and in extreme cases execution as examples to other recruits. Tactical instruction focuses on urban warfare techniques that prove particularly valuable during siege operations. Children learn to move through buildings, set ambushes in confined spaces, and coordinate attacks in crowded environments where adult fighters would be more easily detected. Their small size and innocent appearance provide tactical advantages that Al-Shabaab exploits ruthlessly in operations throughout Mogadishu and other urban areas. The group's use of children as human shields represents one of the most morally reprehensible aspects of their siege strategy. Child soldiers are positioned at the front of attacking formations, knowing that government forces will hesitate to return fire against obviously underage combatants. This tactic has proven effective in urban environments where the presence of children creates complex ethical dilemmas for defending forces and provides Al-Shabaab with significant tactical advantages. Children also serve as suicide bombers in operations designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing Al-Shabaab's loss of experienced adult fighters. The group has developed specialized training programs that prepare children for martyrdom operations through intensive religious indoctrination combined with technical instruction in explosives handling. These young bombers prove particularly effective because their appearance does not trigger the same security responses that adult males would provoke in government-controlled areas. The intelligence gathering capabilities provided by child operatives give Al-Shabaab significant advantages in siege warfare. Children can move through government-controlled areas without arousing suspicion, gathering information about defensive positions, troop movements, and civilian activities. They serve as messengers and scouts, providing real-time intelligence that enables Al-Shabaab to adjust their siege tactics based on current conditions within Mogadishu. Even if Al-Shabaab were defeated tomorrow, the long-term implications of their child soldier program would continue affecting Somalia for decades. Thousands of children have been psychologically damaged by exposure to extreme violence and ideological indoctrination that will be extremely difficult to reverse. Many of these children have committed acts of violence that will make their reintegration into normal society nearly impossible. The broader social impact extends beyond the children directly recruited by Al-Shabaab to encompass entire communities that have been traumatized by witnessing the transformation of their children into killers. This systematic exploitation of Somalia's most vulnerable population has provided Al-Shabaab with a renewable source of fighters that can sustain siege operations indefinitely. But the presence of thousands of international peacekeepers throughout Somalia raises uncomfortable questions about how this recruitment continues unchecked despite massive international military intervention designed to prevent exactly these outcomes. The peacekeepers who don't keep peace. ATMIS operates under bureaucratic constraints that make decisive military action nearly impossible. Every significant operation requires approval from multiple layers of command that stretch from field commanders through national capitals to international headquarters. This approval process can take weeks or months while Al-Shabaab moves with complete tactical flexibility. When peacekeepers finally receive authorization to respond to a threat, the operational landscape has usually changed completely, leaving them fighting yesterday's battles with tomorrow's paperwork. Military commanders on the ground report frustration with command structures that prioritize diplomatic considerations over tactical effectiveness. Operations that could disrupt Al-Shabaab's siege preparations are delayed or canceled because they might violate the political sensitivities of contributing nations or international partners. This creates a situation where peacekeepers watch Al-Shabaab establish positions and build defensive works because engaging them would require approvals that will never come in time to matter. Contributing nations bring conflicting national interests that undermine any possibility of unified command or coordinated strategy. Ethiopian forces operate with different rules of engagement than Kenyan units, which follow different protocols than Ugandan battalions. These contradictions reflect competing regional interests rather than shared commitment to Somali stability. Ethiopian peacekeepers focus on preventing Al-Shabaab expansion toward their border rather than protecting Mogadishu. Kenyan forces prioritize operations that support their own counterterrorism objectives along the Somalia-Kenya frontier. The result is a patchwork of military units that often work at cross purposes despite wearing the same peacekeeping insignia. Intelligence sharing between national contingents remains limited because each country protects information that might benefit their regional competitors. Joint operations require extensive negotiations between national commanders who answer to different capitals with different strategic priorities. This fragmentation ensures that peacekeeping forces cannot present a unified front against Al-Shabaab's coordinated siege strategy. Restrictive rules of engagement handicap peacekeeping operations in ways that Al-Shabaab has learned to exploit systematically. Peacekeepers cannot engage targets unless they meet specific criteria for imminent threat, even when those targets are clearly preparing for future attacks. They cannot pursue fleeing combatants across certain boundaries or into areas designated as politically sensitive. They cannot target infrastructure that supports Al-Shabaab operations if that infrastructure also serves civilian populations. These restrictions transform peacekeeping forces into reactive security guards rather than proactive military units capable of disrupting enemy operations. Al-Shabaab commanders understand exactly what peacekeepers can and cannot do under their current mandates, allowing them to plan operations that exploit these limitations. They position military assets in locations where peacekeepers cannot legally engage them. They conduct operations using methods that fall outside the peacekeepers' authorized response protocols. Corruption within peacekeeping ranks has compromised their mission in ways that directly benefit Al-Shabaab's siege operations. Peacekeeping supply chains leak weapons, ammunition, and equipment that ends up in Al-Shabaab hands through black market networks that include serving peacekeepers. Communication equipment intended for peacekeeping operations has been found in Al-Shabaab possession, suggesting systematic infiltration of peacekeeping logistics. Individual peacekeepers supplement their modest salaries by selling information about planned operations, troop movements, and defensive positions to whoever pays the most. Al-Shabaab has proven willing to pay premium prices for advance warning of peacekeeping activities, creating a steady market for intelligence that undermines operational security. Some peacekeepers have been caught providing direct assistance to Al-Shabaab operations in exchange for cash payments that exceed their official salaries. The intelligence failures that plague peacekeeping operations leave them constantly reactive rather than proactive in their approach to the siege threat. Peacekeeping intelligence networks rely heavily on information provided by Somali government sources who often have their own agendas or limited access to accurate information. The result is intelligence that arrives too late to be actionable or proves completely inaccurate when operations are planned around it. Al-Shabaab has infiltrated peacekeeping supply chains so thoroughly that some military analysts suspect the group receives better intelligence about peacekeeping capabilities than peacekeeping commanders possess about Al-Shabaab operations. Supply contracts for peacekeeping operations are awarded to local companies that employ Al-Shabaab operatives or sympathizers. These positions provide access to detailed information about peacekeeping equipment, deployment schedules, and operational capabilities. Political constraints prevent peacekeepers from engaging in the offensive operations that would be necessary to break Al-Shabaab's siege positions around Mogadishu. The peacekeeping mandate emphasizes stability and protection rather than active combat against insurgent forces. This distinction matters enormously when facing an enemy that has chosen siege warfare as their primary strategy because sieges can only be broken through offensive action. International law and peacekeeping doctrine limit peacekeepers to defensive operations that protect specific installations and populations rather than offensive campaigns that could eliminate the source of threats. This creates a strategic impossibility where peacekeepers are expected to prevent a siege while being prohibited from attacking the forces conducting that siege. The result is a defensive posture that allows Al-Shabaab to maintain the initiative while peacekeepers respond to threats they cannot eliminate. The transition from AMISOM to ATMIS created operational gaps that Al-Shabaab exploited with remarkable speed and effectiveness. The reorganization required months of administrative work that distracted from active operations. Personnel rotations during the transition left some sectors temporarily undermanned while new units learned their responsibilities. Command relationships had to be re-established and new procedures implemented while Al-Shabaab continued their operations without interruption. This transition also reduced funding and resources available for peacekeeping operations at the exact moment when Al-Shabaab was intensifying their siege preparations. ATMIS has struggled with a deficit of $150 million since the beginning of its mandate in April 2022, according to official reports. This funding shortfall has hindered the mission's ability to meet its objectives while Al-Shabaab maintains steady revenue streams from their taxation operations. The strategic reality facing Somalia today is that international peacekeepers have become part of the siege problem rather than its solution. Their presence creates an illusion of international engagement that discourages more effective intervention, while their operational limitations ensure they cannot address the actual threats facing Mogadishu. But while the African Union struggles with these fundamental limitations, other international actors have made far more ambitious commitments to Somalia's security that carry even greater risks. Turkey's dangerous game. Turkey has made one of the most audacious military commitments in modern Africa by establishing Camp Turksum in Mogadishu, which represents their largest overseas military base anywhere in the world. This facility has become the centerpiece of an ambitious strategy to project Turkish power across the Horn of Africa and into the Indian Ocean region. The base trains elite Somali units, including the Gorger Commando Brigade, while serving as a launching point for Turkish military operations throughout southern Somalia. What appeared initially as a humanitarian gesture following the 2011 famine has evolved into a comprehensive military engagement that places Turkish forces directly in the path of Al-Shabaab siege operations. The strategic liability created by this massive investment becomes apparent when examining how the base has constrained Turkish operational flexibility rather than enhancing it. Camp Turksum requires constant protection from Al-Shabaab attacks, diverting military resources that could otherwise support offensive operations. The facility's fixed location makes it a predictable target that Al-Shabaab can strike at times and places of their choosing. Turkish forces find themselves defending static positions rather than conducting the mobile operations that might disrupt Al-Shabaab's siege preparations around Mogadishu. Turkish military advisors operating from the base have attempted to train Somali forces using counterinsurgency doctrine developed for different conflicts in different regions against different enemies. These training programs emphasize conventional military tactics that proved effective in Turkey's operations against Kurdish insurgents in mountainous terrain. The problem is that Al-Shabaab operates in urban and semi-urban environments using siege tactics rather than traditional insurgency methods. Somali units trained in Turkish doctrine find themselves unprepared for the patient methodical approach that Al-Shabaab has adopted around Mogadishu. The training regimens focus heavily on direct engagement tactics and rapid response operations that assume an enemy seeking to avoid prolonged contact with government forces. Al-Shabaab has demonstrated exactly the opposite approach by maintaining sustained pressure through siege operations that exploit the weaknesses of forces trained for conventional combat. Turkish advisors have struggled to adapt their training programs to address siege warfare because their own military experience provides limited guidance for defending against an enemy willing to maintain territorial control over extended periods. Turkey's extensive economic investments throughout Somalia have created multiple high-value targets that Al-Shabaab can attack to demonstrate their continued capability while imposing costs on Turkish involvement. Turkish companies have invested heavily in infrastructure projects including roads, airports, hospitals, and telecommunications networks that require ongoing security to remain operational. Each of these facilities represents a potential target that Al-Shabaab can strike to undermine confidence in Turkish protection while demonstrating their ability to operate throughout areas nominally under government control. The February 2024 defense agreement between Turkey and Somalia, which grants Turkey 30% of revenue from Somalia's exclusive economic zone in exchange for naval training and coastal patrol services, has further increased Turkish exposure to Al-Shabaab attacks. This 10-year commitment requires Turkey to maintain naval assets and personnel along Somalia's 3,333-kilometer coastline, creating additional targets while spreading Turkish forces across an area too large to defend effectively against determined attackers. Turkish drone operations have failed to break Al-Shabaab's siege tactics despite conducting at least 19 confirmed strikes since 2022 using Bayraktar TB2 drones sold to the Somali government. These operations achieve tactical successes by eliminating individual Al-Shabaab commanders and destroying specific facilities, but they cannot address the systematic approach that Al-Shabaab has adopted for their siege strategy. Drone strikes target visible concentrations of enemy forces, but siege operations rely on dispersed positions and patient coordination that present few opportunities for decisive aerial engagement. The limitation of drone warfare against siege tactics becomes apparent when considering that Al-Shabaab's strategy depends more on territorial control and economic pressure than on large military formations that drones can effectively target. Their checkpoint systems, taxation networks, and infiltration operations cannot be disrupted through aerial bombardment because they operate through existing social and economic structures rather than military installations. Turkey's military presence has complicated coordination with other international forces operating in Somalia by introducing additional command structures and national interests that must be balanced against existing peacekeeping arrangements. Turkish forces operate under different rules of engagement than African Union peacekeepers and pursue objectives that sometimes conflict with broader international strategies. This fragmentation benefits Al-Shabaab by preventing unified responses to their siege operations while creating opportunities to exploit divisions between international partners. Al-Shabaab has identified Turkish forces as particularly valuable propaganda targets because attacks against them generate international attention while demonstrating the group's capability to strike foreign military forces. Turkish casualties carry greater propaganda value than losses inflicted on African peacekeepers or Somali government forces because they represent direct challenges to a NATO member nation with significant regional ambitions. This makes Turkish personnel and facilities priority targets that Al-Shabaab can attack to achieve strategic communication objectives beyond their immediate military value. The geopolitical calculations driving Turkey's Somalia commitment reflect broader regional ambitions that extend far beyond counterterrorism operations. Turkey seeks to establish itself as a major power in the Horn of Africa to compete with regional rivals including the UAE, Iran, and Saudi Arabia who have made their own investments in the region. This regional competition has created a situation where Turkish success in Somalia has become a matter of national prestige that limits Turkey's ability to adjust its strategy based on operational realities. The risk Turkey faces is becoming trapped in an unwinnable conflict where withdrawal would damage national prestige, while continued involvement requires escalating commitments against an enemy that has demonstrated remarkable staying power and strategic patience. But Turkey is not the only international power that has made massive economic commitments in Somalia that Al-Shabaab can exploit to pressure foreign involvement and the UAE's port power play. The United Arab Emirates has established strategic control over Somalia's economic lifelines through a network of port investments that has fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Horn of Africa. DP World, the UAE's state-owned ports operator, controls critical maritime infrastructure that handles the majority of goods flowing into and out of Somalia. This control extends far beyond simple commercial operations to encompass the ability to regulate international trade, monitor cargo flows, and influence the economic relationships that determine Somalia's survival as a functioning state. The UAE's port empire has become so central to Somalia's economy that any disruption to these operations would immediately affect the country's ability to import food, fuel, and essential supplies. DP World's port operations have evolved into leverage points that Al-Shabaab recognizes as critical vulnerabilities in their siege strategy against Mogadishu. The group understands that controlling or disrupting these facilities provides them with economic weapons that complement their military operations around the capital. By targeting UAE port interests, Al-Shabaab can inflict economic damage that extends far beyond immediate military casualties to encompass the broader commercial relationships that sustain international involvement in Somalia. The ports represent choke points where relatively small disruptions can create cascading effects throughout Somalia's economy. Al-Shabaab has developed sophisticated strategies for targeting UAE economic interests as a method of pressuring international involvement while demonstrating their capability to strike high-value foreign assets. The February 2025 attack on the General Gordon military base in Mogadishu, which killed Emirati soldiers, exemplifies how the group has escalated beyond economic targets to direct military confrontation with UAE forces. This attack served multiple strategic purposes by eliminating foreign military personnel, demonstrating Al-Shabaab's reach into supposedly secure areas, and sending a clear message to the UAE about the costs of continued involvement in Somalia. The targeting strategy extends beyond spectacular attacks to encompass systematic disruption of UAE commercial operations through harassment, taxation demands, and infrastructure sabotage. Al-Shabaab operatives infiltrate port labor forces to gather intelligence about shipping schedules, cargo manifests, and security procedures. They conduct surveillance of UAE personnel and facilities to identify vulnerabilities and plan future operations. This sustained pressure campaign creates an atmosphere of insecurity that increases operational costs while demonstrating Al-Shabaab's persistent threat to UAE interests. The competition between UAE and Turkish influence in Somalia has created additional complications that Al-Shabaab exploits to their advantage in the siege context. Both countries have made substantial investments in Somali infrastructure and military capabilities, but their competing approaches often work at cross purposes rather than creating unified international support for the government. The UAE focuses on economic control through port operations and commercial investments, while Turkey emphasizes military training and direct security assistance. This division allows Al-Shabaab to target each country's specific vulnerabilities while preventing coordinated responses to their siege operations. Port revenues have become a central battleground between the government and Al-Shabaab, with control over these income streams determining each side's ability to sustain military operations. The Somali government depends heavily on port taxes and customs revenues to fund its limited administrative functions and pay security forces. Al-Shabaab has implemented parallel taxation systems that compete directly with government revenue collection while demonstrating their administrative capabilities to local populations. The sophistication of Al-Shabaab's taxation network often exceeds the government's own revenue collection capabilities, creating situations where businesses find it easier to pay Al-Shabaab taxes than navigate corrupt government bureaucracies. The UAE's involvement in the Somaliland port deal has created a diplomatic crisis that complicates federal government relations while providing Al-Shabaab with additional propaganda opportunities. The agreement granting Ethiopia access to Red Sea port facilities through Somaliland directly challenges the federal government's sovereignty claims and undermines efforts to build national unity. Al-Shabaab has expressed firm opposition to the Ethiopia-Somaliland deal, positioning themselves as defenders of Somali territorial integrity while the federal government appears unable to prevent foreign powers from negotiating directly with breakaway regions. Maritime security around UAE-controlled ports has become increasingly complex as Al-Shabaab adapts their tactics to target international shipping while maintaining pressure on government forces. The group has demonstrated capability to conduct maritime operations that threaten commercial vessels approaching Somali ports. These threats force international shipping companies to implement expensive security measures that increase the cost of trading with Somalia while reducing the volume of commercial activity that generates government revenues. Al-Shabaab's port taxation schemes represent direct challenges to UAE commercial interests by imposing parallel fee structures that compete with official port charges. International shipping companies report receiving demands for additional payments beyond standard port fees, with these unofficial taxes collected through intermediaries who claim to represent local business facilitators. Container inspection procedures have been compromised by Al-Shabaab operatives who use their positions to identify valuable shipments for additional taxation or outright seizure. The UAE's economic model in Somalia depends fundamentally on stability and predictable commercial operations that Al-Shabaab actively undermines through sustained pressure campaigns. Every successful attack against UAE interests, every disruption of port operations, and every taxation demand imposed on international shipping companies reduces the profitability of UAE investments while demonstrating the government's inability to provide security guarantees to foreign partners. Economic warfare around ports has evolved into a central component of Al-Shabaab's siege strategy because controlling these facilities provides leverage over both the government's revenue streams and international support networks. The group understands that sustained pressure on port operations can force the UAE to reconsider its Somalia commitments while demonstrating to other potential international partners the risks of economic engagement with a government that cannot protect foreign investments. But Al-Shabaab's success in creating these economic pressures depends on more than military tactics and financial leverage. Their ability to sustain siege operations while maintaining international legitimacy requires sophisticated communication strategies that shape how their actions are perceived both locally and globally. The propaganda war. Al-Shabaab's media operations reveal how information warfare has become the invisible foundation supporting their entire siege strategy. The Al-Kataib Media Foundation functions as their primary propaganda arm, operating with organizational structure and professional capabilities that many recognized governments cannot match. They maintain dedicated studios equipped with professional lighting, high-definition cameras, and advanced editing software that produces content indistinguishable from legitimate news broadcasts or military documentaries. Their multilingual production capabilities demonstrate strategic thinking that extends far beyond local insurgency operations to encompass global recruitment and influence campaigns. Al-Kataib produces content in Arabic, Somali, English, French, and Swahili, targeting specific audiences across different regions and demographic groups. Each language version receives culturally specific adaptation rather than simple translation, with messaging tailored to resonate with particular audiences based on their political grievances, religious backgrounds, and social circumstances. Global distribution networks disseminating Al-Shabaab content operate through sophisticated online infrastructure, including dedicated websites, social media accounts, encrypted messaging platforms, and peer-to-peer file sharing systems. These networks demonstrate remarkable resilience against disruption attempts, with backup systems and mirror sites that automatically activate when primary distribution channels are compromised. The technical sophistication required to maintain such networks suggests access to professional information technology expertise that rivals corporate or government capabilities. Social media platforms have been weaponized to recruit fighters and spread psychological terror in ways that maximize impact while minimizing operational exposure. They create content specifically designed for viral spread through existing social networks, using algorithms and engagement strategies that mirror commercial marketing campaigns. Their recruitment videos combine high production values with carefully researched psychological triggers that appeal to specific demographic groups identified as potential fighters or supporters. Fear campaigns conducted through social media exploit the interconnected nature of digital communications to amplify the psychological impact of siege operations. Videos of successful attacks are edited and distributed within hours of completion, creating impressions of constant threat and government helplessness. These rapid response media operations demonstrate coordination between military and propaganda wings that allows them to extract maximum psychological value from each kinetic operation. Professional quality videos documenting military victories serve multiple strategic purposes beyond simple propaganda by providing detailed documentation for tactical analysis while demonstrating operational capabilities to potential recruits and adversaries. The production quality often exceeds that of government forces or international organizations operating in Somalia, creating stark contrasts that reinforce Al-Shabaab's image as a competent and well-resourced organization. These military documentaries include detailed footage of weapons captures, tactical operations, and prisoner interrogations that provide intelligence value while serving propaganda purposes. The systematic documentation creates archives for training purposes while demonstrating operational tempo and capabilities to international audiences. Professional editing and narrative structure transform tactical victories into strategic communications that influence perceptions far beyond Somalia's borders. International media coverage has been manipulated through carefully orchestrated information campaigns that exploit Western media practices and biases. They understand how international news organizations operate and provide content that meets editorial requirements while advancing strategic messaging. Press releases are distributed through professional channels that resemble legitimate news sources, making it difficult for journalists to distinguish between authentic reporting and propaganda. The group has developed relationships with sympathetic journalists and media organizations that provide platforms for their messaging while maintaining plausible deniability about propaganda objectives. They exploit international media's focus on dramatic incidents by timing operations to maximize news coverage while ensuring their narrative frames dominate subsequent reporting. The sophistication of their media manipulation suggests detailed study of international journalism practices and decision-making processes. Psychological warfare campaigns targeting Somali government morale operate through sustained messaging that portrays Al-Shabaab as inevitable victors while depicting government forces as corrupt collaborators destined for defeat. These campaigns combine religious messaging with nationalist themes that resonate across clan divisions, positioning Al-Shabaab as legitimate defenders of Somali sovereignty against foreign occupation and domestic betrayal. The messaging emphasizes the futility of resistance while offering amnesty to government forces who surrender before facing inevitable defeat. The psychological impact extends beyond immediate military targets to encompass civilian populations whose support government forces require for effective counterinsurgency operations. Al-Shabaab messaging creates doubt about government capabilities while reinforcing perceptions of Al-Shabaab's strength and determination that make civilian cooperation with government forces appear dangerous and pointless. Alternative information ecosystems in Al-Shabaab-controlled territories ensure their narrative dominates local discourse while preventing contradictory messaging from reaching populations under their influence. They operate radio stations providing news, entertainment, and religious programming specifically designed to reinforce ideological messaging while meeting information needs of local communities. These radio operations demonstrate understanding of how information consumption patterns in rural Somalia differ from urban areas or international audiences. Control over information flows extends to educational materials, religious instruction, and commercial advertising that collectively create immersive propaganda environments where Al-Shabaab messaging appears natural and authoritative. Children growing up in these controlled information environments receive continuous exposure to Al-Shabaab ideology through multiple channels that make alternative viewpoints appear foreign and threatening. Religious messaging provides justification for siege tactics and civilian casualties through sophisticated theological arguments that frame operations within accepted Islamic principles of warfare and governance. These religious justifications are developed by trained Islamic scholars within Al-Shabaab ranks who provide theological cover for operations that might otherwise appear contradictory to Islamic law. The religious messaging addresses potential moral concerns among supporters while providing ideological motivation for fighters engaged in prolonged siege operations. International perception of the conflict has been significantly influenced by Al-Shabaab media strategy, which frames siege operations as legitimate resistance against foreign occupation rather than terrorism against civilian populations. Their messaging emphasizes the defensive nature of operations while portraying government forces as illegitimate proxies for foreign powers. This narrative strategy has proven effective in generating international sympathy while obscuring the aggressive nature of siege tactics. Information warfare has evolved to become as crucial as kinetic operations because controlling the narrative around their operations determines international support levels, recruitment effectiveness, and civilian cooperation that ultimately determine whether their siege succeeds or fails. But their most cynical manipulation extends beyond propaganda to encompass the systematic exploitation of human suffering itself as a weapon of war. The humanitarian weapon. Al-Shabaab has weaponized the displacement of 3.5 million people into a strategic tool that serves their siege operations around Mogadishu with calculated precision. The humanitarian crisis becomes a weapon of war when displaced populations depend on aid flows that Al-Shabaab controls, live in camps that Al-Shabaab infiltrates, and move through territories where Al-Shabaab determines who survives and who does not. This exploitation of human suffering operates through systematic manipulation of the international humanitarian system that was designed to alleviate crisis, but instead enables Al-Shabaab to pressure the government while strengthening their own operational capabilities. Control over humanitarian aid flows provides Al-Shabaab with leverage that extends far beyond simple extortion to encompass strategic pressure on government legitimacy and international support networks. International aid organizations operating in Al-Shabaab territory must negotiate access agreements that give the group veto power over which populations receive assistance and which areas remain cut off from relief supplies. These negotiations transform humanitarian organizations into unwilling participants in Al-Shabaab's siege strategy by forcing them to accept conditions that benefit military operations in exchange for permission to deliver life-saving assistance. Aid convoys traveling through Al-Shabaab-controlled areas face systematic taxation that generates revenue while providing intelligence about government supply lines and international operations. The group maintains detailed records of all humanitarian shipments passing through their checkpoints, tracking everything from medical supplies to food distributions. This intelligence allows them to identify vulnerable populations that depend on continued aid flows and use access to these supplies as pressure points against both the government and international organizations. Refugee camps throughout southern Somalia have evolved into recruitment centers where Al-Shabaab operatives identify potential fighters while gathering intelligence about displaced populations and their connections to government forces. Camp administrators report pressure to employ Al-Shabaab sympathizers in positions that provide access to refugee registration data, family information, and personal backgrounds of displaced individuals. These positions allow Al-Shabaab to build comprehensive databases of displaced populations that support both recruitment operations and intelligence gathering activities. The recruitment process within camps operates through a combination of religious outreach, economic incentives, and coercive pressure that exploits the desperation of displaced families. Young men facing unemployment and food insecurity become prime targets for recruiters who offer steady income and regular meals in exchange for military service. Families struggling to feed their children face subtle pressure to provide sons for Al-Shabaab service in exchange for preferential access to aid distributions or protection from harassment. Taxation of humanitarian organizations represents a sophisticated revenue stream that Al-Shabaab has developed into a reliable funding source for their siege operations. International agencies operating in Al-Shabaab territory pay multiple forms of taxation, including fees for access permissions, taxes on equipment imports, charges for security services, and levies on staff salaries. These payments are calculated as percentages of project budgets and collected through formal invoicing systems that demonstrate Al-Shabaab's administrative capabilities while generating substantial revenue. Displacement creates extensive intelligence networks that benefit Al-Shabaab siege operations by providing real-time information about government activities, international operations, and civilian movements throughout southern Somalia. Displaced populations moving between government-controlled and Al-Shabaab-controlled areas serve as unwilling intelligence sources who provide information about conditions in areas they have left or plan to visit. The constant movement of displaced people creates information flows that Al-Shabaab operatives can tap to. Monitor government military preparations and international aid activities. Food insecurity becomes a tool for forcing population movements that serve Al-Shabaab's strategic objectives by creating displacement patterns that benefit their siege operations. The group manipulates agricultural production and market access to create localized famines that force populations to move toward areas where Al-Shabaab can control their access to relief supplies. These engineered displacement crises serve multiple purposes, including depopulating areas that might support government forces, concentrating vulnerable populations in locations where they can be more easily controlled, and creating humanitarian emergencies that strain government resources. International aid organizations have been infiltrated by Al-Shabaab operatives who use their positions to gather intelligence while influencing humanitarian operations to benefit military objectives. Staff members sympathetic to Al-Shabaab provide advance warning of aid deliveries, share information about humanitarian assessments and planning documents, and influence aid distribution patterns to benefit Al-Shabaab-controlled populations. These infiltrations operate through a combination of ideological sympathy, financial incentives, and coercive pressure that makes detection extremely difficult. Humanitarian corridors that international organizations negotiate to deliver aid in contested areas become tactical advantages that Al-Shabaab exploits for military purposes during siege operations. The agreements that establish safe passage for humanitarian convoys often include restrictions on government military activities along these routes, creating gaps in defensive coverage that Al-Shabaab can exploit for troop movements and supply operations. The predictable timing and routes of humanitarian convoys also provide cover for Al-Shabaab logistics operations that can blend with legitimate aid movements. Civilian suffering becomes direct leverage in negotiations with both the government and international partners who face constant pressure to make concessions in exchange for humanitarian access. Al-Shabaab can threaten to cut off aid flows to vulnerable populations or escalate attacks on displaced communities to force concessions from government negotiators or international organizations. The systematic nature of this leverage demonstrates how Al-Shabaab has integrated humanitarian manipulation into their broader siege strategy. The humanitarian crisis has evolved into both a consequence and fundamental tool of Al-Shabaab's siege strategy because the group understands that controlling access to life-saving assistance provides them with influence over government legitimacy and international support that conventional military operations alone cannot achieve. But the implications of their success extend far beyond Somalia's borders, as their tactical innovations and strategic victories create templates that other extremist organizations across the region are already studying. The regional domino effect. Jihadist movements across Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Uganda are closely monitoring these developments with clear intention of adapting proven methods for their own territorial ambitions. The siege model that Al-Shabaab has perfected around Mogadishu offers a replicable strategy that requires relatively modest resources while potentially achieving massive strategic gains. Regional extremist groups have already begun studying how Al-Shabaab controls supply routes, implements taxation systems, and maintains sustained pressure on urban centers without requiring large conventional military forces. Kenya faces immediate threats from Al-Shabaab operatives who have demonstrated their ability to conduct complex operations across the Somalia-Kenya border while building support networks among marginalized communities in northeastern Kenya. The February 2024 attack on a police station in Wajer County that killed 6 officers exemplifies how Al-Shabaab has expanded their operational reach beyond Somalia to test siege tactics against Kenyan security installations. These cross-border operations serve as proof-of-concept missions that allow Al-Shabaab to evaluate the effectiveness of their methods against different targets and security environments. Ethiopian security services report increasing incidents of copycat attacks that mirror Al-Shabaab tactics, including coordinated assaults on government installations, systematic targeting of supply convoys, and attempts to establish checkpoint systems in remote areas. The Oromo Liberation Army has begun implementing taxation schemes that directly copy Al-Shabaab's revenue collection methods while adapting them to local economic conditions and clan structures. These tactical adaptations demonstrate how Al-Shabaab's siege strategy has become a model for insurgent groups throughout the region who seek to challenge government authority through sustained territorial control. Success in Mogadishu would provide Al-Shabaab with dramatically expanded resources for regional operations, including access to port revenues that could fund extensive cross-border campaigns. Control over Mogadishu's port facilities would generate millions of dollars in annual revenue while providing Al-Shabaab with leverage over international shipping that connects East Africa to global markets. The weapons and equipment that could be purchased with these resources would enable Al-Shabaab to supply allied groups throughout the region while maintaining the operational tempo required for simultaneous siege operations against multiple targets. The psychological impact of a successful siege against a major African capital would resonate throughout jihadist networks worldwide while demonstrating that patient territorial control can achieve what spectacular attacks cannot. Regional extremist groups would gain confidence from Al-Shabaab's demonstration that international military intervention and peacekeeping forces can be defeated through sustained pressure and strategic patience. This psychological boost would likely trigger attempts to replicate the siege model in other major cities throughout East Africa, where local grievances and weak governance create similar vulnerabilities. Transnational networks connecting Al-Shabaab with regional jihadist groups would benefit enormously from a successful siege by gaining access to proven tactical methods, experienced military advisors, and financial resources that could support expanded operations. The Islamic State has maintained cells throughout East Africa that coordinate with Al-Shabaab on logistics and intelligence sharing while seeking opportunities to establish their own territorial control. Al-Qaeda affiliates in the region would gain significant credibility from Al-Shabaab's success while accessing resources and expertise that could enhance their own operational capabilities. Regional trade routes that connect East Africa to international markets would face systematic disruption as expanded Al-Shabaab control spreads their taxation and checkpoint systems across critical transportation corridors. The northern corridor that links the port of Mombasa to Uganda, Rwanda, and Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo handles billions of dollars in trade annually while supporting the economies of multiple landlocked nations. Al-Shabaab expansion into areas that control segments of this corridor would enable them to impose taxation schemes that could disrupt regional commerce while generating massive revenue streams. Maritime security throughout the Indian Ocean would deteriorate significantly if Al-Shabaab gained control over additional port facilities that could serve as bases for naval operations and piracy activities. Their success in Mogadishu would likely inspire attempts to replicate siege tactics against other coastal cities, including Mombasa, Dar es Salaam, and smaller ports that handle regional trade. The combination of land-based siege operations with maritime threats would create a comprehensive challenge to regional security that existing military and law enforcement capabilities are not equipped to address. Neighboring countries would face the necessity of completely overhauling their counterterrorism strategies to address siege warfare tactics that their current military doctrine does not anticipate or prepare for. Kenya's focus on border security and rapid response operations would prove inadequate against patient siege tactics that exploit economic vulnerabilities rather than seeking direct military confrontation. Ethiopian counterterrorism efforts that emphasize conventional military operations would require fundamental restructuring to address enemies willing to maintain territorial control over extended periods while accepting high casualty rates. Refugee flows generated by expanded siege operations would destabilize the entire Horn of Africa region by creating displacement crises that overwhelm existing humanitarian systems while straining government resources throughout the region. Uganda already hosts over 1 million refugees from regional conflicts and lacks the capacity to absorb additional displaced populations that would result from siege operations in Kenya or Ethiopia. The displacement patterns created by siege warfare would differ significantly from conventional conflict displacement because siege operations create long-term territorial control that prevents refugee returns while generating sustained outflows of displaced populations. The demonstration that patient territorial control can defeat modern military forces and international intervention would encourage extremist groups on every continent to adapt these tactics for their own territorial ambitions. What began as a localized conflict in Somalia has evolved into something far more dangerous for global security, raising fundamental questions about whether conventional counterterrorism approaches remain adequate against enemies who have learned to exploit the weaknesses of modern warfare itself. The strategic implications of Al-Shabaab's siege operations demand immediate international attention before their methods spread beyond Somalia's borders. Al-Shabaab has accomplished something that military experts dismissed as impossible in modern warfare. They have successfully combined siege tactics that haven't changed since medieval times with contemporary asymmetric strategies to encircle a major capital city while international forces watch helplessly. This represents a fundamental shift in how terrorist organizations can challenge recognized governments and control territory. Their success in Somalia provides a disturbing blueprint for jihadist movements worldwide. The patient, methodical approach of siege warfare offers extremist groups a proven strategy for achieving territorial control without requiring massive military resources or direct confrontation with superior forces. The question now is whether the international community will respond before this becomes the standard template for global